Gamers, gals, and my non-binary pals. It's your boy, back in the React Mines, talking about my favorite format, Genesys. MBT made a video about it, a pretty short and sweet one. My feelings about Yu-Gi-Oh's brand new format, and I think that I want to give it a watch. I purposely held off on watching this. I wanted to watch this in the shower so bad, or while eating my fucking slop ramen, but you know, had to hold strong for you guys. So let's give it a watch, and yeah, let's see how I feel about this.
Good afternoon, Jank enthusiasts. I'm MBT, and let's do one of these again. It's been a while since I've delivered this flavor of slop to your discerning piggy palates. An unlistenable ramble that I hand off to the nearest editor, and they prune it into something that is monetizable. Let me make their job a little harder by cussing in the first 30 seconds. Anyway, the reason that I'm delivering this low-effort bargain bin content to you is the same reason that I wasn't at YCS Pittsburgh. I had planned on attending and grinding the hell out of Genesys format. If you're unfamiliar, Genesys format is a new way to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Every card is legal, but the powerful ones have a point total associated with them, and your deck can only be a certain number of points total. At Pittsburgh, and at most places, that cap is 100. Anyway, I had planned on spending the weekend scrubbing out of 16-person events, but unfortunately, my first child was born.
There is a very, very funny timeline where NBT, if he was like 80% worse as a person, missed the birth of his child to go play Genesys. And like the infinite universe string theory, this is a universe where that might have happened. Also, insane freeze frame.
Like, do you even care about my future career as a Fire King one-trick? If you were at Pittsburgh and were intending to meet me, I'm very sorry I wasn't able to meet you, but obviously this takes precedence. Anyway, rather than talk about my experience with the Genesys, I decided to listen to some of yours. A lot of individuals all over the internet have given me feedback about the event, what they played, what they saw being played, and what they won and lost with. And using that information, I'd like to talk very generally about Genesys as a whole. What was good, what was less so good, and what they'll have to do in order to improve the format for the future. So let's begin with what worked. First and foremost, demand for Genesys at YCS Pittsburgh was insane. I had individuals telling me they fired over 60 pods of Genesys, which is a pretty tall order for an event that fills up at 16 rather than 8. Because invitations are given to the first and second place individuals in each pod, that means there could have been up to like 128 people in the Day 2 Invitational. Secondly, the format is massively diverse. If you look at the top 8 of the Invitational, you'll see 6 different decks represented, and the 2 Radiant Typhoon decks are built pretty noticeably differently than each other. And finally, the top decks are exactly what I wanted to see. Frequently, they are decks that just didn't have their time in the sun in otherwise overpowered sets. So Onomat had an entire pack of really cool stuff we never...
To be fair, Onomat is a little cancer. Maybe there's a reason that Onomat never really saw much play. And it's because A, Droll Lock Bird and the inability to go second. But also B, like, did you want this deck to be in the sun? There was one thing this deck did real well too. It involved Eclipse Twins and a little snake guy, just saying.
Got to see explored, and it ended up winning the event. Archmage is one of the most promising archetypes of modern memory, but unfortunately can't really compete against the top tier. Of course, Radiant Typhoon needs no introduction. Vanquish Soul still has a retirement home after being jettisoned from K9. Punk showed up a couple of times as a fan favorite that, of course...
It's very funny how underrepresented Punk is. Like, this deck reads like it should be broken. But even before the points adjustment, this deck just didn't really see much play. Like, it feels like it should be really good. It doesn't even lose that hard to droll. Like, it doesn't really lose that hard to droll. Like, sure, you can say, like, oh, combo deck lose to mid, but, like, you know, who cares? Like, you can say that about, like, fucking anything. Like, this is a deck that feels like it just should have performed better in my mind's eye. Like, I don't know. Like, why does this deck suffer? Is it because, like, Seaman has, like, the biggest, like, target on its head? But we now have, like, new Foxy Tune. Or, like, the one with the womb tattoo? I don't know what its name is.
Does not often get its day in the sun. And Draco Tail was there. All right, they can't all be winners. So a pretty strong foundation for a format I
Draco Tail was broken! What do you mean Draco Tail was not a winner? Draco Tail was, like, one of the best decks ever! I think Draco Tail, although it is a very homeless, flavorless, bland-ass deck that has, like, no individuality whatsoever, I do think it is, like, an objectively good Genesys deck. I think it is very frustrating to play against it because it's just an advanced deck that has like some random like point limits. But oh my god, that deck is so fucking cancer sometimes.
Unfortunately, not
The
everything
card
is
quality
perfect.
is still
and as a
broken.
result, I've broken the complaints I have with the current format into 3 specific subgroups. The first of which is hand traps. The Genesys devs need to determine where they stand on hand traps. So obviously one frustration that Genesys has with modern TCG is that your deck building begins by shoving in usually the same 12 or 15 hand traps into every strategy. Ash Blossom, Fualos, Droll Lock Bird of late. To counteract this, they've pointed...
Remember when Dyer thought that Fualos is gonna be like a bad card? Very, very funny. Very, very funny at the time. I think like Dyer and I got into like a mini debate over like whether or not you needed to play Fualos, and like Dyer's positioning was like, you don't have to because modern combo decks have been curbed before without needing it. And I'm like, okay, but modern combo decks were still extremely successful. Adding like one more way to stop them is an objectively good thing. Although I do hate how it's basically a floodgate.
Some of the more popular hand traps, which includes a significant amount of the ones that just straight up end the turn. For a lot of these rogue decks, they really can't play through something like an Ash, and Ash is aggressively costed as a result. Instead, a whole new suite of hand traps emerged at early Genesys to replace the hand traps we were missing. Things like Rescue Ace Impulse, and DD Crow, and Skullmeister. As an evolution from that, and as a result of some point changes, those staple hand traps have also shifted. Represented in the top 8 lists, you will see a lot of hand traps, and they're kind of frustrating ones. As of the last points update, Droll and Nibiru are both 5 points apiece, and these were played pretty consistently across almost every deck. The only ones that weren't playing them were the decks like Vanquish Soul that just couldn't afford to do so by virtue of an engine that requires 99 points. Personally, this frustrates me a little bit. Droll and Nibiru are frequently turn enders, a la Ash Blossom against a rogue strategy. They accomplish a purpose within Genesys, artificially adding turns to the turn count. If you Droll and your opponent has to pass, and then they Droll and you have to pass, I mean, technically there was back and forth, but they're kind of at odds with the gameplay loop of every single deck released in the last decade. I think a lot of players, especially the ones I talked to, voiced their frustration at these cards' ubiquity and the gameplay that resulted from their use.
Again, I mentioned this in the Peeps video that may or may not be released already, but the TLDR is effectively like one of the things that you should have to determine when getting into Genesys is understanding the hand traps that are viable and having to come to the internal conclusion of whether or not you think playing a deck that is resilient / non-resilient to Droll, Nibiru, whatever, or Ash, is something that you are comfortable with. Again, I want, like, when I played Dinomorphia, one of the big reasons why I played it was because you just couldn't fucking hand trap it. You can't hand trap it, you couldn't really, like, blow it up with back row hate because it didn't really exist, or like Hey True Nade or Twin Twister was just not really that efficient versus it. Like, just because silver bullets exist within a format does not mean you have to resign yourself to your fate on picking a deck that loses to a silver bullet. Like, yes, it does suck if you want to play like White Forest, for example, but I don't know what to tell you, but not every deck is gonna be the greatest deck of all time or be always competitively viable. You know what I'm saying?
Personally, I don't see why these cards aren't costed at 7. Other hand traps
Yeah, they
like
should be
Fualos that
costed at
frequently end
7
the
or
turn
10,
ended up
100%.
there. And the difference between a 15-point splash and a 21-point splash can be the determinant factor as to whether you do or don't play a playset of something. I mean, for instance, very few people are playing Fualos. I really like that board breakers specifically are almost never costed in Genesys.
Okay, slight argument against Fualos. Fualos is not a very good card in Genesys. Specifically just because the format is so wide. Like, you could definitely play it as like a side deck option, but you definitely should not be maining Fualos because of the fact that not every deck really even loses to Fualos. Fualos is a card that you want to play that's designed to like stop your opponent's turn or just give you a bunch of fucking cards in hand because you're able to play a pretty low point whatever, because you're able to play like a pretty low point total, and you're able to just draw into a bunch of like your engine and extenders and then shit on your opponent. It's kind of how like Gem Knight functions in the TCG, where like you don't really want Fualos to stop them. You want them to play into the Fualos because you're able to draw like 10 billion breakers and like your 4 Gem Knight extenders that are basically uninteractable unless your opponent has exactly Droll or like Shifter. And as a result, Droll can feel like kind of frustrating, and as a result, Fulos sees a lot more representation in TCG because, every deck is going to always play into Droll in some capacity. Even decks like Mitsurugi don't always really play into Droll, but they give like 2 or 3 draws for every now and then, which is like pretty good. But it is a lot worse in Genesys, where people's endboards are much, much weaker, and there don't exist as many like climbing tools in the same way. There don't exist as many extension tools as they do in the TCG, such as with the existence of Link Monsters being a big one. Like, most of your draws off of like Fulos are going to be because your opponent has to like weave like their random extra deck extender or their main deck bridge into like their combos, and because those don't exist in Genesys as much, it's just not as good. So while I do agree with the idea that like Fulos does have like a pretty significant point total, and we should be looking to point hand traps at around that total, I don't think that the 2 cards are comparable in the context of Genesys.
Dark Ruler No More and Ultimate Slayer are in a lot of side decks, but I think that's good. I think those cards are not so strong that they totally invalidate a board, but are pretty good when it comes to chewing through an established setup. What I want is for hand traps to hinder the building of a board without expressly stopping it, to make room for both hand traps and board breakers to exist in the same strategy. That's where I think cards like Ghost Ogre really shine, and by the way, I think the Ghost Ogre change was just totally inspired. One final note on hand traps before we move on. 2 changes that are just absolutely bonkers are Rescue Ace Impulse to 5. Come on, is Vanquish Soul so good that you have to stop a random fire card that basically...
Rescue Ace Impulse never needed to go to 5. Rescue Ace Impulse could be at like -12, and it still probably wouldn't even see that much play.
Basically became the mascot of Genesys and requires a Garnet. And Mourner at 3. It's weird that Mourner's at 3 and Valor's at 7. Mourner's not like a better card than Valor, but accomplishes a similar purpose. And because the point of Genesys to some degree is to bring lapsed duelists back into the fold, Mourner for me represents this really frustrating card because you have to kind of engage with Yu-Gi-Oh's rules weirdness. Like, Mourner is a card that requires you to ask your opponents sometimes, will you be performing anything by holding quick effect priority? Which is like, a total turnoff. Secondly, let's talk about costing fresh decks. So the Genesys devs have been very specific that they are not sure whether they want to release decks pointed or give them a little room to play, especially if they're lower powered. I want to go on record and say I think it's really cool that they didn't. Artmage being a top strategy, for instance, is awesome. The only pointed card in there is the weird fusion that was also a Link 3 that other people were playing, but I think they have to be a little less aggressive when it comes to releasing these unhit. And what I'm talking about here is specifically Radiant Typhoon. Radiant Typhoon took up a quarter of the top 8, which is not a ton, but talking to duelists on the ground, pretty much all of them had to play at least 1 Radiant Typhoon to clear, and maybe played more in the Invitational as well. I would hazard a guess that it was the most represented deck by a lot. This is frustrating.
Like, Radiant Typhoon, very, very easy to understand why it was like as powerful and as represented. It is both completely unhit, it is pretty affordable, it is very, very it is very, very easy to play, it's a pretty easy to build deck, like, and it is a deck that has come out in like recent sets, so like gathering the cards for it isn't even difficult. Like, Radiant Typhoon was borderline born just to thrive in Genesys, which I'm not sure I'm actually the biggest fan of, but whatever.
For a number of reasons. The Genesys devs are on record saying they hit Vanquish Soul because you could port a Vanquish Soul deck from Advanced into Genesys by just taking out the Canine cards. But the Radiant Typhoon cards are seeing play too as
the exact same thing.
Setup tools for Malice. Yes, it's different. The game plan of Radiant Typhoon totally changes when you don't have Link monsters, but it's kind of frustrating that Vanquish Soul ate this unbelievable hit and Radiant Typhoon ate nothing. It's not helped by the fact that Radiant Typhoon's game plan is kind of frustrating to sit across the table from. One of the 2 Radiant Typhoon decks is on Runic, and that seems to be the dominant build of the deck, even though one of the other top 8 players is issuing it entirely. Those games are just like slogs. Like, is it worth keeping an unfun play pattern in the format just because, like, you can? And while we're on the subject of Radiant...
The answer is no. Radiant Typhoon is it's not a very interesting deck, because it kind of just, like, does the exact same thing every time. And especially with, especially with the Runic cards. You basically kind of, like, flip a coin. You kind of, like, roll 2 dice. And those 2 dice are going to come up to, like, 2 random Runic spells that your opponent might have in hand. And, like, Runic just does the exact same... Radiant Typhoon just does the exact same thing, where they end on, like, a Rake 3, maybe 2 Rake 3s, and the Shuffler. And it's a very flowcharty matchup, where it's like, can you beat this board? And if it's like yes, then you win. Congratulations. And it's like, can you extend through the runic stuff that they may or may not have? If the answer is yes, then congratulations, you win. But if it's like any of this is no, it's just like, okay, cool, just game 2. Because you know you're going to get out-engine quality. Because 2025 archetype. Is Genesys not made to bring back returning players? Why are the newest decks running the format? Genesys was made, from what I understand, in order to allow players to play shitty old decks and weird cards in order to express themselves. Because Genesys was born out of a desire for people who wanted to have a place to play their jank decks, or bad decks, or lower quality decks, or decks that couldn't survive in the TCG as well, but did not feel comfortable like playing them in an advanced tournament and basically going like X4 and like blowing like $5 to $10 on their locals entry for like no reason otherwise than to lose. You know what I mean? That is like effectively in a nutshell the prime reason why Genesys does exist, and also to make money off of like weird product like the Megatons.
Typhoon, what was the Mirage of Nightmare point change? That card was very playable at 10 points. It's now at 0 and features in both of the Radiant Typhoon builds, one in the main and one in the side. What frustrates me about this strategy is that if you release a deck completely unhit, they can do something that kind of frustrates me in the context of Genesys. Many of these Radiant Typhoon builds are totally ignoring the rules of Genesys and playing a TCG legal Radiant Typhoon list that they've slotted 3 Pot of Greed into because they can. I think the point of this format should be to interact with the boundaries of the format, not to throw in an automatic win condition into a deck that you could otherwise just enter at any other event. And before you get on my ass about the Totem Bird Cicada King hit, like, whatever, that's totally negligible. The third thing I think the Genesys devs need to come to a consensus on is if macro counts as a floodgate.
Yes. Yes.
Banishing cards often just ends the game plan of a deck, but not always, and a lot of the cards that perform a banishing function are particularly susceptible to novel pieces of removal.
The reason why like I'm very like pointed versus Droll Lock Bird in favor of it, whereas when it comes to like Macrocosmos and DiFi, I'm very against it. It is because there is no gameplay pattern with Droll Lock Bird versus DiFi. If you activate DiFi, is either a card that literally wins the game on the spot or does literally nothing. Droll Lock Bird at least creates some scenarios where you are still able to function and play. Like, you won't be able to, like you're gonna lose some win rate points, like, obviously. But it is not a card that just says immediately end your turn. Like, you could still function and, like, Onomat if you do get Droll Lock Birded. The reason why, like, DiFi and Macrocosmos and Shifter can feel so frustrating is because there is no way to play around that sort of interaction. Either your deck cares about it, or your deck does not. And if your deck cares about it, you effectively lose on the spot. And if your deck doesn't care about it, then congratulations, your opponent just feels like shit. Because they're like, I guess like this DiFi was kind of stupid. DiFi to counter Droll is crazy work. Also, that being an interaction is really stupid, and I fucking hate it.
Genesys has gone out of its way to cost most floodgates extremely high. They don't want you playing Teakfu, they don't want you playing barrier statues, and that's good. But they're kind of two minds about macro. Some monsters, like Masked Hero Darklaw, are a prohibitive amount of points, and despite the fact that it's my favorite card, that's a good thing. But DiFi and macro are free. As a result, a lot of decks in the top 8 and a lot of decks in Swiss were boarding copies of DiFi and macro for when they went first. Like, against a significant amount of decks, it just automatically wins. Why wouldn't you play it? I think that type of silver bullet sideboarding sucks. It just turns the game into a match of Go Fish, and I think the Genesys team should come to a consistent consensus on if they want removing from play to be something that's available ad nauseum. If so, give me back Darklaw. What the hell?
The big issue is, from what I heard, it was at the first couple Genesys pods, people were not really playing DiFi because like DiFi decks weren't like decks that lost to DiFi were not that prevalent, and honestly decks that even lost to DiFi their win rate points were actually high enough to kind of say like they beat DiFi on like paper. Okay, like for example, Exosister was a deck that played DiFi and Shifter, but people just kind of shit on Exosister. Like, that deck was not very like that. Even if that deck opened Shifter or whatever, it wasn't so good that, you know, like better quality decks, or even decks that just like didn't automatically lose to it, like something like Generator, for example, is like at times would just run you over, and you're just like, whatever. And additionally, it didn't hit Vanquish Soul. Vanquish Soul was like the big thing to beat at the first two YCSs, and Vanquish Soul did not even lose to Di-Fi. And in fact, they fucking played it, or played Shifter. And as a result of this, Di-Fi's like win rate percentage points look a lot worse than they should be. But now that like Vanquish Soul doesn't really exist, and like Droll Lock Bird is everywhere, like even more so. And people have optimized these deck building patterns, such as with Onomat, and realize, hey, like Di-Fi could just be like a pseudo Call by the Grave. And then, like all of a sudden, this guy's winner. Like all these cards like Macro and Di-Fi are gonna look a lot more cancer.
And that's it. I know this video may come off negative because I spend so much of it heeming and hawing about like point math, but the reason I have so much to say about this minutia in Genesys is because the format at large is good. I think given the interest at YCS Pittsburgh, it's undeniable that this is something. And as a result, yes, I'm going to be annoying and nitpicky about it, but it comes from a place of true belief that this could be the future of Yu-Gi-Oh! And the format really should be given the amount of care it deserves. That's that. See you tomorrow.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the points. Some of the points I have disagreements with, but overall, very, very good video. Very well put. Very eloquent. Reading a Twitter thread. Fuck that shit. I like it when the white boys speak to me. Anyways, let me know what your guys' thoughts are on the format as a whole. Let me know if you agree with MBT, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.